life. Love is central to the nature of God, whose essential element is heart, which is the source out of which love is flowing. So whether love works or not will decide the outcome. So this diagram is also about a process, do you understand? Of origin, division, union, action. It's a process through which love is flowing, energy is flowing, life is flowing, the purpose of life is flowing and getting realized or not getting realized. So sex is not a problem if it's in the right context and if it's correctly motivated. It's the same with everything. If something's properly motivated, if the relationship is rooted in the heart of God and the love of God, and if when if this man becomes one with God, and then when he relates to Eve, he doesn't relate to take something from her or to exploit her or to use her for his own happiness, but filled with the love of God, he relates to her to give the love of God to her and to love her on behalf of God. Then this is something extraordinarily beautiful. But that's why love is so beautiful, but also so extraordinarily painful. So relationships are not bad, but you could easily misunderstand. If you have a bad experience, you might think, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world is men. That's what's wrong with the world. If it wasn't for all these terrible men who use violence, who exploit, who, domestically abuse their wives, then the world would be a better place. So just kill all the men, right? Then the world would be a better place. No, this may sound funny, but it's not so funny. I was just talking to Christian, because this is very profound. Christian was explaining to me he was teaching the German language to the American ambassador to Austria. And whilst he was teaching her, he felt how difficult it was for her to learn. She wanted to learn because she's the ambassador to Austria. She has to learn German. But it was so difficult to learn. And he explored why. She said because Hitler was German and he was Austrian actually. And he spoke the German language. So when I hear this language, I'm reminded of Hitler. But it's like cut down all the fruit trees. We will not make a better world by eliminating the German language, do you understand? Because one person used it badly. So the problem is not men, the problem is men who don't have the heart of God. It's anybody who doesn't have the right motivation. But when that incorrect motivation is applied to the most decisive, precious and important relationship in all of the creation, the most central, because there's the first blessing, right? The second blessing and the third blessing. This is the central one. The first blessing is leading basically to this place where the love of God comes down on earth and passes to the next generation. So why is this so decisive? If you don't apply love correctly, if you don't make the right connection between the vertical and the horizontal, the cause and the effect, if you don't establish it through this pattern of how love grows and develops, if this inheritance doesn't come from here, but instead it comes from there, it's very problematic, right? So, for example, this is quite a poignant type of example. A child that's being sexually abused will have huge difficulties in later life in interpersonal human relationships. Because this is really, your sexuality is connected to the essence of your being. And when someone's been misused in that way, it's a profound attack on the core of the person's being and nature. That's why you examine the consequences of sexual abuse. It's so extraordinarily profound. So can you understand what we're talking about? So please don't misunderstand and think German's the problem because there was Hitler, right? Or think sex is the problem because... No, it's motivation, do you understand? It's the heart that lies behind. But if I eat my lunch with a bad attitude, this is not good. I may get indigestion, I'm offending the food, I'm offending God who gave food, with a certain purpose, and I'm not relating it correctly. And it's not good. but it will not undermine all humanity. But this is very central. That's why it's so significant. So let's look for some evidence that actually the problem is to do with sexual relations. Isn't it interesting? In many of the great faith traditions, the path of religion, which is the path to restore man from ill health back to health, to provide the cure, many great religions employ a practice of abstaining from sexual relations. Not because sexual relations are evil, but because people are not able to control their appetite. Do you understand? They're not able to control their appetite. So they engage in things with the wrong attitude to exploit the other person. When this is another soul, another living being, another child of God, and you're touching the essence of their being and the most precious matters of love, this is not a small matter. So why celibacy? It's not because the ultimate goal of religion is that we're all celibate, never have any children and all die out. This is not the goal of religion. The goal of celibacy is the purification of the motivation. It's the recovering of self-control. Right? And similarly, what a strange thing. You know, when in the beginning of Judeo-Christianity, in Abraham's family, God said to Abraham, you should circumcise your children. What a strange thing. You know, Hindus have a mark on their forehead and people have all sorts of different costumes. Sikhs have turbans. But, you know, cutting the male foreskin, what a strange thing to mark your religion. What's that to do with? It's an act of purification. It's an act of purification. And, you know, why is sexual misconduct so frowned upon, so condemned within all the great spiritual traditions? Let's just read a few quotations from different faiths. So from Hinduism, it's better to die than to indulge in partaking of forbidden, lustful pleasure. And from Buddhism, the man who goes to the wife of another digs up the very roots of life. And from Islam, do not come near adultery, for it is a shameful deed and evil, opening the road to all other evils. Or from Christianity, flee from sexual immorality. He who sins sexually sins against his own body. Anyhow, there's a lot of content in there in religious teaching about how this is a very important thing to avoid. Because it's, do you understand, it's employing the wrong pattern in this pattern of relationships, which is supposed to realize joy, happiness and goodness. And yet if it's taken over by the wrong motivation, it makes something so painful and dreadful and incredibly damaging. Other evidence, well, whatever this was, according to the biblical story, it didn't just impact on Adam and Eve. It passed down through the generations. Because as it expresses in, Jesus himself said, as recorded in John's Gospel, you are of your father the devil. You belong to your father the devil. And your will is to do his desires. So the implication is we need a purification of the motivation, the heart, the love, the passing of love from generation to generation that lies behind us. Or the lineage needs to be purified. Or, as Jesus also put it, we should be born again. In other words, we need to restart our life in a higher quality of love in order to resolve everything. So love is very important to resolve everything. So what's the profound experience of discipleship that changes people's lives and bring them to a higher level of existence? Essentially, they are born again through new love. Love of the spiritual founder, love of the guru, love of God coming down through the spiritual leader that touched their hearts and gave them the connection to God. Because what are we in search of? We're in search of our lost homeland, right? We're in search of my father's seed and my mother's egg that should ideally have met each other directly under the love of God, together with the love of God. And that should have been my starting place. We're in search of that, lost homeland in that sense, the place of my origin. Very profound thought. So we need to start my life again in the love of God. Very interesting, profound matter of how to be born again. Similarly, you look at human history, and it's a very striking matter. Civilizations might be very rich and very militarily successful, economically successful, but once they enter into immorality, they actually start to decline, because it breaks down the very fabric of society, and the love is passed from generation to generation. So we have a huge problem in our developed, rich, wealthy Western societies. And that problem is we don't know how to love. And wealth is making us greedy. We're losing spiritual control. We don't have the right motivation. We don't understand the purpose of our life. We imagine the purpose of life is something other than it really is. We imagine the solution to life is wealth, when wealth alone is not the solution to anything. You have to get your heart right. The number one revolution is the revolution inside myself, which is the revolution of my motivation, which comes from restoring my relationship with God. So I know how beloved I am of God, and so I embark on all my relationships to pass the love of God to the other and to fulfill the intention of God through my relationship, to make God happy, to make the other person happy. So once that's lost, society is in grave, grave, grave danger. So what was the process of the fall? That's the title. Sorry, that's the title. The process of the fall and the motivation behind it. Because motivation is the key, right? Heart is the key. What is heart? Heart is the source of motivation. So when I examine myself each day of my life, or each moment of my life, or when I examine my relationships, what do I have to check? I have to check my motivation. Is it pure? I have to be able to observe myself. This is awfully difficult to do. Very difficult to do. To really see what is my motivation. Sometimes you're so shocked. I think now I got white hair, I'm an old man. I imagine I might be a bit wiser. And then sometimes you catch yourself so unbelievably immature. You find yourself jealous of somebody else's good fortune. And you notice it and you think, what sort of idiot are you that you can be jealous of someone else's good fortune? What sort of nonsense is that? What sort of nonsense is it that when someone is preferred to you, you feel, disregarded? Some sort of type of pride comes up in you and you can't accept it. Do you know this type of things? Yes. You might imagine that only stupid people have those, but I tell you they don't. You read the life history of Mother Teresa. She went through a very torturous period in her life when she felt so many difficult feelings. She felt, where am I spiritually? Where am I? Isn't it extraordinary? So, it's exactly right. Why are we talking about ideals when there are so few ideal people? So everybody ideal, put your hand up. All the saints, all the gurus, all the holy men and women, put your hands up. How's it like that? How is it like that? And how did it become like that? So this is a very insightful part of the principle. Now you might struggle. I think I struggled a bit when I first, I wasn't so much into Adam and Eve, as a factual reality. I wasn't so much into that. But what we're seeking to discover, well, first of all, we need to have a sense for the ideal, which is not what exists, so it's difficult to have a sense for it because you don't see it so much. But the next thing we want to know is what caused the problem. And then only when you know what caused the problem can you find the reversal process taking you back to the direction of good health. Right? So that's what we're in search of. So this is very insightful. This archetypal story of this interaction between the archangel and Eve and Adam is profoundly insightful as to what goes wrong all the time in interpersonal human relationships. Very, very gets to the absolute heart of the cause of all the problems. If you can understand about that and find out how to put it right, then actually it's not magic dust, do you understand? Yeah. It means you then embark on a process to reverse. So if you found out really what was wrong, then you can put it right. So if the problem with the world is men, you just kill all the men. But if the problem in the world is wrongly motivated men, angry, unhappy, immature men, that's another matter. You don't have to kill them. The problem with people who make crimes is that they're just evil and you just hang them or cut their heads off, and the world, well, some people believe in that solution. It's a sort of solution, do you understand? But isn't a better solution to transform people, to change people? Because actually when you die, you don't die, do you understand? You do die, but you continue to exist. So in a sense, it's not the final solution. Okay, so got to be careful of my time. So as I'm not finished even the first lecture for this morning yet, so I've got to be a bit careful. Got to get this watch off. So remember we talked about this before. Man's in this very special position. We don't just have a physical nature that exists in the physical world. We have a spiritual nature. We know about this. We all know about it. Because we don't just value the human body, we value the human spirit. So you're a very stupid person if you just marry someone because they look nice. Because if you find out a couple of weeks later that actually they're very nasty inside, you made a major mistake. And however beautiful they look will not save you from the misery that's coming. And you won't see them as beautiful anymore if they're not beautiful inside. So we all know about this. But this side of us relates to the physical world, this side of us relates to the spiritual world. And what's more, we explain what's man's position, because man is the one who can most fully resemble God to the point of being the image of God. Man is the center of the physical world and the center of the spiritual world, the ruler, the microcosm, the mediator between the two. So we're going to examine about a relationship between human beings and a spiritual being. There's the angel, right? There's the angel. So this is the angel. So if you examine scriptural content, not just within the Bible, but also, of course, within other spiritual teachings, particularly Islam as well, for example, they refer to angels. And angels play very critical roles in revelation and in messages from God. They are messengers and servants of God. Also, there are many illustrations of angels worshipping God, singing the praises of God in the spiritual world. And the implication is angels reside very closely to God. And amongst the angels, Scripture refers to certain key angels who were in a very close position and were at the top of the hierarchy of angels. Lucifer is one of those angels. He was in this intimate interaction with God. So there's probably a few... Oh no, there's not so much there. Okay, so let's... It's very interesting later to put this into the context of my own life and the challenges that we face. But, basically what the implication of this is, before the creation of human beings, God and the angels were in this close relationship. When God wanted something, He directed the angels, and the angels responded. And amongst the angels, He directed the leading angels, and closest of those was this particular archangel. And through Lucifer, God related to the remainder of the angels and to the rest of the created world, spiritual world, and even through the spiritual world to the physical world. So very close relationship here. But what sort of relationship? Master-servant relationship. So this is not... servant doesn't mean low. I don't know about in your culture, but in Britain we have civil servants. Do you know this expression? There are people who are the servants of the nation in the highest positions of government. But so servant doesn't mean low. Servant in this context means someone who has a function in the hierarchy of God. Do you understand? But the function is not the same as a child. Servant is different from child. That's the distinction. So when Adam and Eve... So there was God and the angels before, and then when Adam and Eve were created, according to the story, Lucifer's position altered in relationship to God. Or at least he felt as if it altered. Because no longer was the relationship primarily between God and Lucifer, but now God began to relate to Adam and Eve. And Lucifer could observe that the potential closeness of relationship between God and Adam and Eve was closer than the relationship between God and Lucifer. And Lucifer sensed that in the end, God was going to pass the inheritance to his children, Adam and Eve. And then Lucifer began to question about his own situation. In other words, we're talking about feeling a question, does God love me? And feeling a feeling towards others, why are they receiving more than me? So I tell you, you examine wrong motivation and where it springs from. Where it springs from is insecurity about am I loved? And based on insecurity about am I loved, then jealousy and ill feelings towards someone you imagine is more loved than you. I tell you, this lies at the root of misconduct. So, have you ever heard the expression sibling rivalry? It means that struggles between brothers and sisters, right? So what's the solution for the struggle between brothers and sisters from parents? The solution is to allow the children to feel loved. Then they don't have to fight each other for that. Anyhow, this is a very profound matter. So, what does that imply? It means in this that Lucifer lost confidence that God is loving him. God still did love Lucifer, and God was going to be true to Lucifer in the way that God treated Lucifer, and when God's final creation came to completion, Lucifer would not be left out or ignored or put into a difficult position. But Lucifer lost confidence in God. That's the problem. There was a separation in heart. So fundamentally, when things go wrong in my life, or in anybody's life, where's the first place they go wrong? They go wrong in the relationship ultimately to God, or in the line of love coming from God. And I have this sense of, am I loved or am I not loved? Am I valuable, am I not valuable? And then this means when you relate to others, you no longer relate to them to give what you already got from God. You relate to them to get from them what you feel you're not getting from God. Can you understand this point? Can you understand this point? This is a very profound point. I worked in a therapeutic community with children who'd been emotionally, sexually and physically abused. And they did not relate to us as the staff according to how we related to them. They related to us as the staff according to how they'd been mistreated by the people who looked after them previously. So as a staff, when the children treated you some very strange way and threw their fists and their legs and their screams and their shouts, or when little girls tried to seduce you sexually by their conduct, strange conduct, you had to understand this is nothing to do with you. This is to do with their experience before. Something very different. So anyhow, once Lucifer lost his relationship with God, then his relationship to Adam and Eve altered, because he no longer related to them centering on God's purpose as part of the four-position foundation, in so much as his role was to guide them and be almost a mediator between God and them during the period they were growing up. He began to relate to them with a desire to receive through this relationship what he was missing from God. Isn't it a profound matter? What motivates paedophiles? What motivates paedophiles? So strongly that they can't stop being a paedophile. Do you understand? What are they in search of? What are they trying to get? They're trying to find a partner who they can dominate. Do you understand? To get what they want. What's that all about? You think about what lies behind it in terms of their previous experience in relationships and why they need to have total dominion and why they have no empathy, why they have no compassion. They may be able to pretend empathy, do you understand? They may be able to be nice to the children to win their confidence, but ultimately their intention is to totally exploit them. And they're convinced because they're getting something good from it, that it's good for the child as well. But it's unbelievably perverse. You know, where's it come from? It comes from this problem. No, not love, not value, not able to get love, looking for love someone else from someone you can dominate with what you've got. And through that domination, you're not fulfilling the will of God, you're not fulfilling the life of the other, you're exploiting them. Anyhow, the angel said to Eve, you will not die when you eat the fruit. When you eat it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. This was contrary to what God said. So, of course, when the paedophile is influencing the child, the paedophile absolutely doesn't want the child to tell the parents when they make their first sexual advance. Do you understand? When they start to move it towards something sexual, they don't want the child to tell the parents. Why? Because if the child tells the parents are going to be round there to, sort the situation out. They're not going to be happy. So, anyhow, the archangel built a relationship with Eve, whereby ultimately what happened was he could draw her into a relationship which was a love relationship, but not a natural love relationship. It was a relationship between male and female, and a love relationship, but not centered on God, motivated by this person as the subject. She was the object, but his intention was not coming from his relationship with God, was not true to God's love or God's intention. It was total and absolute exploitation, selfish motivation, using her for his own desire. But they had a sexual relationship. As a result of that relationship, which took place between their spiritual beings, this is just emphasizing they could have a very real relationship. This wasn't something unreal, because she has a very strong awareness of her spiritual being. He's a spiritual being. They really had a sexual relationship with one another through their spiritual bodies, if you like, in the spiritual world. This is just some other evidence in the Bible of interactions between angels and human beings. Very, very, seems like they're almost very physical. Why? Because something that's happening spirit to spirit resonates into the physical of the person who has a physical body as well. So although it's happening spirit to spirit, in the body, in the physical body, they feel it and sense it too, because the spirit and the body are interconnected. So next what happens is Lucifer's been cut off from God and relates to Eve not for God but for himself, and then through the process he cuts Eve off as well, or she allows herself to be cut, or she cuts it in order to prefer Lucifer to God. And then actually what happens next is she pursues Adam as a way to somehow return to God. So let's see that in the diagram. So Lucifer doesn't trust God. It's not that God doesn't love Lucifer or doesn't have a plan for Lucifer or isn't true to Lucifer, but Lucifer doubts God and then finds an alternative way to search for happiness. But then in seeking to draw Eve to himself, he cuts her off ultimately from God by creating a relationship which has nothing to do with God, which is not a small relationship. It's not smelling a flower together. It's not looking at a cloud together. It's not, having a little conversation with one another. It's an all-consuming love relationship, which then cuts her off from God. And then Eve, who feels this dramatic cut from God in her life, or if you like to put it in that context, the child who is raped in this type of situation. How is this, what sort of barriers are being created through this relationship between the child and the parents? And this one, the paedophile or the seducer, is absolutely determined to cut them off completely. So feeling cut off, the principle explains that then Eve began to relate to Adam, wanting to find love, wanting to return to God. She now felt fearful and guilty, but she understood about this relationship. So centering on this relationship, she who'd been seduced by Lucifer, in other words, he aroused in her desire for love and ultimately for sexual love. Now she aroused in Adam his desire for love, but her intention and motivation had nothing to do with God and nothing to do with for the sake of Adam. It was to solve her own difficult feelings and to try to find the love that had somehow got lost and damaged and try to find her way back to God. But instead of finding her way back to God, she cut Adam off from God too. Because when Adam engaged in this relationship, he put this relationship before that relationship. So you have to understand order. Which relationship you have to secure first in order... So I tell you, the principle is very deep, and I can't explain it all now, but the principle explains the love you got from your parents and the love you have for your parents is the foundation for the love for your husband or your wife. The way your dad loved you if you were a girl And the way you love your dad is the foundation for the way you love your husband. It's profoundly interconnected. Psychologically, this is very, very profound. So, what was a spiritual fall became a physical as well as a spiritual fall in the relationship between Eve and Adam. Okay, that's that one. So now I've got to do the next one. So this one I'm going to have to do a little bit faster than ideally it would be. But in a sense it's because it's not easy to... I'm concerned that I explain something well enough for you to catch as much of it as possible. Or if you can't catch it all, to begin to understand this is very interesting. This is very interesting. This is very insightful. We are looking at something which, if we can resolve it, can sort out families, sort out the damaged human heart, sort out human beings, create a human revolution. We can discover not, my parents' marriage was miserable or didn't work out or they got divorced, so let's abandon marriage. Let's abandon sincere relationship between men and women because it's impossible. No, that would not be the answer. The answer is to find out how to improve it, because actually that's a very central part of the purpose of life. Can you catch the point? If you misunderstand, you can put to one side the very purpose of life. If the purpose of life is love between human beings and you substitute money for it, or paedophilia for it, or something else you substitute, you are not going to get happy. You're going to get increasingly miserable because you don't comprehend the purpose of life. You're seeking a purpose of life where it doesn't exist. And you're going to not just be damaged yourself, you're going to damage everybody else and damage even God. That's what's going to happen. So, part 2. Very key question. How was this possible? Key point is this a design fault? In other words, is this God's responsibility? Or is there some interplay between God's responsibility and human responsibility that means it's our responsibility, not a design fault? Because if it's our responsibility, not a design fault, what does it mean? It means we have the power to put it right. We have the responsibility to put it right. And we can live in that much more ideal world of love that we long for and that God originally intended. It's not a crazy dream. We're being prevented from realizing it by all this misconduct, all this disorderly conduct, all this damage to the core essence and heart of human beings, because even their conception is not correctly connected to the love of God. Do you understand? So, but anyhow, big question. How could it happen? Was this God's mistake? Was this a design fault? Well, the principle is very clear. Once you reach here, in other words, once you're mature, there's no way, once you're mature and you're one with God, there's no way you can go wrong. But during this growing up period, of course, if you're wrongly influenced, you can go in the wrong direction because you're not mature. You're not formed. You're not completed. And God cannot directly relate with you. So during that period, we're guided by the force of the principle. In other words, we're following rules and laws passed to us by God, but without that direct heart-to-heart relationship with God. So, do you understand? When you learn to drive, it's quite complicated. Especially if you've got not an automatic, but those gear ones, right? And you've got to push down this foot and pick up that one. And you're doing, have you ever done the hill start? Do you know the hill start? You're on the hill. And you've got to get the clutch in just right so the car doesn't, but goes up the hill. It's difficult. But then when you've been driving for a year or two, you don't even think about it anymore. Your body just does it, right? Without a thought. It's automatic. Do you understand? That's what's happening. Same with when you're first learning to play the piano, it's so frustrating. Because you just got to keep the rules and you've got to discipline yourself every day, and there's no joy in it. And what does the teacher want to get you to do? The teacher wants you to get to know a little bit enough so you can play a nice little piece of music and feel joy. And they need to give you a little bit more joy, a little bit more joy, a little bit more joy. But then when you become the concert pianist, it's like you don't even think about your fingers anymore. It's just your heart flows direct through your body into the soul of the music, and it explodes, you know, in the total freedom of the mastery of music that you possess. Do you understand? Isn't it extraordinary? So during this period, fundamentally, we're following a guideline. It's the guideline of love, because we are not yet love. So in order to behave according to love, we need someone to explain what is love. And you need to keep the way of love. By keeping the way of love, you grow to know what love is yourself. But unless you do, you don't. Do you understand? So during this period, the force of the principle is guiding. But if some other force comes and knocks you, that's more powerful than the force of the principle, then actually you won't make it to here. You get knocked off course. So that's what the principle is saying. The principle is saying, and this is not a design fault, God made love more powerful than law. Love is more than law. Because what's the purpose of law? The purpose of law is to realize love. The purpose of love is not to realize law. So you don't want to end up after all that practice still having to just discipline yourself. You want your heart to flow free. So the purpose of law is to enable you to love. Law is more than love. You know,
opposite.
Sorry, love is more than law. Beg your pardon. So, you know, in the relationship between myself and Manuel, you know, should it just be formality? How do you do, Manuel? How are you feeling today, Manuel? Thank you, I'm fine. Oh, so good to feel you're fine. I'm fine too. You know, is this what you want it to be in the end? Just formality, do you understand? No, actually you want to meet each other heart to heart, right? So that you don't even have to say that stuff, it's just a formality. You know, you just get in a big hug and your tears fall out of your eyes and you're so happy to see one another because you didn't see each other for a while. That's what you're in search of. That's what you want. So what does God want in his relationship with human beings? He's not looking for just a relationship based on formality and law. Ultimately, God is a being of heart. So God wants a heart-to-heart relationship. So love is more than law. So if there's a challenge, if there's a difference between what the principle says and what love says, so the children who end up being sexually seduced by the paedophile, don't you think they think something a bit strange is going on here, that maybe daddy and mummy wouldn't like me to be doing? Generally speaking, they comprehend that. If not in fact, because they've been taught some elements of morality, about sex or whatever, if they feel something disturbing going on. Something disturbing is going on. They sense this is not right. But, you know, the trick of the seducer is to make the relationship so influential that it can overcome the conscience or overcome the sense of this is not right, the gut feeling coming from the nature of God within you that tells you shouldn't be doing it. So when love is impacting you, which is unprincipled, it can overpower the force of the principle. In other words, isn't it a moment of grave insecurity when the young person is reaching those teenage years, when they're longing for love on another dimension? It's a very insecure time. It's a very important time for them to understand that during that time they have to keep themselves until they complete their development. Because if they engage in a relationship with someone who's ill-motivated, do you understand? Someone who's looking for somebody who they can, you know, I'm older and I'm wiser and I'm looking for somebody who I can manipulate to get to do what I want and take advantage of them. If I allow that to happen to myself, is that a small matter? That is not a small matter. So, you know, we try to teach people to defend themselves against that type of misconduct, right? But if someone, you know, wins your confidence sufficiently, like my friend said, you know, this bottle of dry cleaning fluid, you know, I sniffed it and it's sort of interesting what it does to you. I tell you, it's more than interesting, it's not very good for you. But anyhow, it was quite strange when I did it, and I remember then walking down the street, I felt like some sort of automaton. It was a very strange feeling. But people do all sorts of stuff that kills them because it creates a sensation, you understand?
which is interesting or different or whatever. But I knew I shouldn't tell my parents, and I didn't. But fortunately, I never did it again. Do you understand how the force of unprincipled love can overpower your sense of right and wrong? Because love is more than law. But once you reach perfection, or once you've embodied the principle, so that the principle has guided you into a state of being a person of love, then of course this is not a problem. So once you know true love, you will never be seduced by false love. Never, 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 never. So in other words, once you've reached that level of maturity, this is not a problem anymore. So it's during that growing period. So what did God do to defend the circumstance? God gave a commandment to assist the force of the principle to dominate and prevent the possibility of unprincipled love. In other words, God said, don't do it. It's straightforward. So before you do it, you don't maybe know how dangerous it will be to do it. So, think about the matches. We tell our children, we don't even have matches almost anymore, but matches?
Yes.
Or sharp knives, or the hot iron, or all sorts of things like this. We warn our children how to treat it very carefully. We try to train them. So there is a potential danger, but we add some instructions that really makes them feel, hey, this is a very serious matter. You can really damage yourself with this one. You've got to know how to use it right. And then when you add that to and remember, the force of the commandment is also to do with the bond of trust. So why would you follow something your dad and your mum or your boss or your leader or whatever says to you? Don't do that one. It's not just because of the words, it's because of the bond of trust. Do you understand? You believe your parents love you, so when they tell you not to do something, it's the bond of love that's also holding you, in a sense. It's connected to that. Add that to the principle and it can overpower the person who comes along to try and get you to do something that's against yourself and against the principle. So that's the power of the principle plus the commandment. The commandment was not to eat, but not to have the sexual relationship. So this is the way that it protects. During the growing period, the growth of the immature person is protected and defended by explaining to them, don't engage in this close interpersonal love, ultimately sexual relationship with another, until you've grown to your maturity. So isn't that what we do? Isn't that what we should be doing anyhow, when we're trying to prevent teenage pregnancy, right? I mean, have you heard this strategy to prevent teenage pregnancy? They give you a mannequin baby, and this baby wets itself regularly, makes itself dirty regularly, needs to be fed regularly, it makes noises, and you've got to look after the baby. Do you ever hear this experience of the training for young people, about even young boys as well as young girls? So they start to understand. Do you know this is a different way, but my wife always says to me, when I said to my dad I'd like to have a dog, he said, well, you have to go for a walk twice a day for a year, and then I'll buy you a dog. And in the cars in England, we have a little poster they put in the back of the car. A dog is not for Christmas, a dog is for life. In other words, before you buy a child a dog, you've got to make sure they can take you for a walk twice a day, because if they can't. I remember my children really wanted a pet. I should have gone for the earthworm. We didn't want to go for the dog, so we went for the guinea pig. And to begin with, guinea pigs, you have to clean out the cage, and you have to give them the food, and you have to give them the water. And it wasn't very long before it was me and my wife who was doing all of that. And the children weren't doing it anymore. So anyhow, it didn't quite work out. So, when we're growing, we need to demonstrate the capacity to deal with. So you don't give sharp knives to little kids. You don't give boxes and matches to little kids. And although Lucifer felt separated, he wouldn't be able to seduce Eve. But of course it's got to do with how much Eve trusts God, how strong the relationship is here. If you have a lot more interaction here than you have here, not surprisingly in time, this relationship becomes more influential. So which friends your kids have is very, very, very important. And who they have the most interaction with, very, very important. So in the end then, Eve is also cut off from God by engaging in a relationship with Lucifer. This becomes love, but unprincipled love. It's not properly motivated. It's not connected to God. It's self-centered. He's seducing her for his own benefit, thoughtless of God, thoughtless of her, and even ultimately damaging his own, God's planned future for him. This is also a profound matter which we could examine more another time. So this becomes an unprincipled love relationship. So you can understand then that God set up a mechanism to prevent it from happening. But this mechanism depended on Adam and Eve keeping the commandment, which means they had to keep trusting God's love, even when tempted in a sense by false love. But one thing's very clear, and that is that God makes us free. We talked about that before, don't we? Love is given freely, so we're free. But what does freedom really mean? Freedom doesn't mean license. So this is quite a subtle difference in the English language. So I want to explain it. True freedom, we say, is the freedom of your true nature. So many people don't have a free, true nature. So I know when my wife said that awkward word to me, I should love her back. Because if I say something bad back, some bad energy starts to generate. So I shouldn't do it. What's the freedom of my original mind? It's the freedom for me to know that in my heart I shouldn't say it back, and then I won't do it. Do you understand? But when I do say it, even though my best intention is that I shouldn't, it means I'm not free. That's license. Or when you say, I know I really love my wife, and I know I promised I'd be faithful, but actually that other young woman is so delightful and so beautiful, I can't stop it. I'm a man, I've got sexual appetites, what can I do? Do you understand? But that is not freedom. That is against true freedom. Because you are betraying your wife, your kids, yourself. And ultimately, you're damaging the life of someone else for your pleasure. This is not good. This is very, very damaging. So that's not freedom, that's license. So true freedom always keeps the principle. True free will is from your godlike mind, which directs your body to do things according to the principle, according to the law of love. God, you might think, surely God is free, but God is not free. God is not free to do bad things. A true teacher, are they free to exploit their own pupils? Definitely not. They wouldn't dream of doing it. Their conscience would absolutely tell them never, ever, ever to do it. So that's why it's so disturbing, when you find out the teacher's been seducing the kids in the classroom, little ones even. This is profoundly disturbing because you trusted the teacher. So God keeps his own laws. So this is to do with freedom connects to responsibility. Freedom should be used to realize love, to realize the purpose of creation, to realize joy, to fulfill the plan of God. So if you're feeling a desire which leading you against the will of God, this is not really freedom. So why didn't God stop it from happening? This is a huge other question. Why didn't God stop it from happening? Because God decided that during the period of growth, he would not directly intervene. Human beings will grow according to the force of the principle, according to the laws. And that is correct, because ultimately what has to happen is that we should grow from our own responsibility. So, why didn't I get the 3 private detectives and the CCTV cameras to control my son? Why didn't I purchase them? You might say it's a wise course of action, but in love it is not. Because however scary it is sometimes for parents, you have to trust that they're going to keep the right way. Of course, I don't mean stupidly, Of course you try and help them to avoid danger, but in the end you can't follow them anymore. You can't follow them anymore. And you shouldn't. Or maybe rather than CCTV cameras, you just chain them up in the basement. Then they can't do anything wrong and life will work out great. No, it won't. Definitely won't. So, God made a very good plan, and he will not break his own plan. So he will not break his own plan only to intervene through guidance, if you like, through the law, not directly to intervene in the matter which should be human responsibility. And through fulfilling our human responsibility, through giving responsibility to people, and allowing them the freedom, in a sense, to express their responsibility, they actually end up creating themselves. They end up completing themselves. So God did not intervene, not because God wasn't concerned or not interested. So what happened as a result of the fall? What are the consequences of the fall? Very profound consequences, of course. First, this consequence. So this most precious central love. So what's the purpose of life? The purpose of life is connected to love. If you have no love, no relationships of love, life is a meaningless process. And of the four loves, which are parental love, children's love, brothers and sisters love, conjugal love, the most central is conjugal love, because it determines if the love of God, which it ought to be, comes down on earth and passes to the next generation. It determines this meeting place between man and woman, which is also should be a meeting place with God, so that children are born out of the love of God and the love of their parents. But when that place is violated, because the motivation is wrong, the purpose is not connected to God, but rather it's connected to lack of broken relationship with God, and trying to fulfill my need for love, searching for love for myself, not giving love, then actually very serious wrong impact, wrong tradition, wrong pattern, wrong energies generated, and this creates the false life and the false image from the false life. So that's a very, very serious matter. So the fall represents a complete violation of the three blessings, but God had already given those blessings to humankind. It was part of the plan. So instead of being realized as God intended them, and the key issue is heart and motive, the world was still followed the pattern, in a sense of this type of pattern of life. In other words, men and women still got together with one another. And of course, not everything's been bad, because man still has goodness within. And particularly when man is guided by, for example, good traditions coming from God through religion, this relationship becomes uplifted. But this relationship has been fundamentally impacted by a wrong tradition that's been established. And this wrong type of motivation has impacted the family and society. That's why you see a very different pattern where there's a very high standard of love in a family, then children get great opportunity and receive great fortune, especially when that's built up over the generations. So instead of the three blessings being fulfilled, human beings are not in control of their bodies with their minds, not their good minds. Husbands and wives are not able to establish a standard of love that God originally intended. It's completely the effect of the cause, which is God's love. And people relate to things not well at all, very selfishly, they misuse, they're greedy. So the world is full of very difficult things. But even those difficult things, they follow a similar pattern, but what's fundamentally wrong is the heart and the motivation that lies behind it. It's self-serving and exploitative. It's not to do with true love. So much so, ultimately, that the pattern that's being, is not just selfishness. Behind the selfishness lies the root of it all, which is rooted in that beginning of selfishness, which actually comes from a spiritual being, Lucifer, who became the devil or Satan. So Jesus talked of your father the devil, talked of the God of this world and the God of this age, and so on. So how do we develop an evil mind? The evil mind develops, just like the good mind's supposed to develop, but it develops when we have give and take action between our physical and spiritual beings, but not centered on God and laws and goodness, but centered on mismotivation, the wrong heart and the wrong attitude. Generally what happens then is if you live your life to seek for your self-centered satisfaction, you're generally more physically, immediately orientated desires, then actually you develop this type of habits, this type of mind, and this type of nature. So much so that you can't escape it when you want to. So, if you're a drug addict, some of the children we looked after in the social care system, they were the children of drug addicts. And they were not necessarily, not wanting to be good parents, but when they were in the midst of their drug habit, of course they couldn't be. They couldn't be. Similarly in alcoholism and so on. So they couldn't make the priority between their husband, their wife, their children, and their habit. So they were not in control of themselves anymore. They were controlled by their habit. Do you understand? And they had a mind that was very vulnerable. So vulnerable that if you tempt them with this thing, even though they know it's against their husband, against their wife, against their children, against themselves, they're very vulnerable to it because they develop a certain type of mind and thought. So you can depict a little bit like this. So, we're in this conflictual situation. We have a godly nature, which of course is seeking God and seeking goodness, or seeking people who are good influence in our life, or seeking scriptural truth, or seeking love, or seeking something higher. And if we find that we have good give and take with it, we strengthen this side of our nature, and we build it, and this means that we act out of that desire. And we have unselfish thoughts, we have good loving thoughts, true loving thoughts, and actions. And they're usually not short-term, they're more long-term. They're making long-term happiness, and they're led by our good mind. But we have another aspect which has developed, of course, down through the centuries, and also developed in my own personal life as well, which is another side of my nature which doesn't resemble God. It resembles this nature of Satan. And when I follow that nature, and of course there's many influences coming to that nature, and I act out of it, I do things which actually are selfishly motivated, easily motivated. And when I put those things into action, I end up making myself. This is how you make yourself. Which way you choose to go decides how you make yourself. There's a war within, a battle in the mind of each person, which manifests itself in the battle within myself. But of course, if you've got that bad vacuum cleaner, you don't know if it's going to blow, or you don't know if it's going to suck. If you've got that husband, if you've got that wife, if you've got that father, if you've got that teacher, if you've got that boss, it's very, very problematic. And in some level, if we're truly, truly honest, we all have this conflict going on with us. So, our struggle is not just with physical matters. Anyhow, I better stop now because I'm running over time. I haven't really finished, but I better stop anyhow. Try and do a little bit more before the afternoon presentation to catch up a bit. But I took maybe too long for some things, but I wanted to try and give the beginnings of understanding why this is so important. Because when I first heard it, it's a little bit difficult for me, Adam and Eve, and what's the relevance, Or a little bit difficult things like, are they saying that sex is bad? Or, you can misunderstand so easily. So I want to try and really catch, and also that introduction about health, cause of the sickness, and the cure. Is really important. Thanks very much. So you've got to go another 15 minutes now. So we're not struggling against flesh and blood, this is saying. We're struggling with spiritual forces that are influencing us. Okay, so what's this about? This means that, Satan is creating an influence over us. He can't do it just directly, physically, if you like, but through our spirit. So what does that mean in reality? How many people had a direct spiritual experience here with Satan? I mean, maybe you wouldn't put your hand up even if you have. But some of you have, But, of course, relationships are many times indirect. Please think about this in terms of how evil works in the physical world. So when you get seduced into drug addiction, who do you meet first? Do you meet the drug baron first? You don't meet the drug baron. You meet some guy on the street who himself has just had his life destroyed comparatively recently, and who's been maybe given even drugs free to begin with, got addicted, and then the guy who gave them to him says, you can't get any more for free, now you've got to work for it. So you've got to give drugs to other people for me, and then you can have your own fix. Do you understand? And this is a long chain from the comparatively small person on the street that goes all the way back to the drug baron, living in some millionaire's mansion with a swimming pool in the garden, looking like he's a great guy, maybe even having political influence. but actually he's a dirty beast of an evil devil. But he doesn't look like one, do you understand? But he's behind the whole chain, and he's milking off all the money, and he's destroying the lives of all the people, and he's got the Aston Martin, and he's got the Maserati, and he's got the Ferrari, and he's got 3 wives and 6 girlfriends, and life is great, isn't it? Life is just so great. So please don't think that it always has to be directly Satan. Do you understand? It can also be through other spiritual agencies, and of course also because people have spirits. Do you understand? So if I'm evilly influenced, I, as a physical spiritual being, can of course evilly influence him. So that's what my friend was doing with the dry cleaning fluid, right? But of course, you can't see the evil spiritual influences. But he was going through a very troubled time in his life. Because actually, his mum and dad, and this was a long time ago, this is 40 years ago, more, 40 plus years ago. And his dad and mum were going through a very difficult experience with money. And it wasn't very usual then. And it wasn't very nice for him. And he needed something. So, So he was vulnerable. So please understand, what we're saying is ultimately the source of influence is even coming from the spiritual world. And this is the ultimate source. But, you don't meet the source very often, you meet the whole line of hierarchy that lies underneath. And you can experience this. Isn't it remarkable? When you come out of a very bad environment with a whole load of people who are doing nasty stuff, and you're plucked out of there, and you're put into a place where people are really well motivated, bit by bit you have an opportunity to change. Have you ever heard about boot camp? This is an English expression. So, when they're, I'm not saying this is always the ultimate solution, but when children are totally out of control, teenagers, one solution is to put them in an environment that's very controlled. So they call it boot camp, like almost a military discipline. But the important thing is it's not just military discipline. In other words, you can't leave your bedroom like my daughter or my son leaves their bedroom anymore. You can't, get up when you please at 12 noon or 2 in the afternoon. You've got to start controlling yourself. And to begin with, it feels like you're in the hands of, mercenaries. But what's very important is the people who put the discipline on you are not nasty guys. Actually, they're very loving, caring. They really want to help you, and they know with confidence it works. When I was in that therapeutic community with the kids, you had a shift, right? Do you know a shift? It means you're on duty for 8 hours, let's say. But if you were on 24/7, you've got a big problem, right? So, when parents are faced with this circumstance, they have to care, and they have no way out, they can't cope with it. So take them out of that circumstance, put them in a situation where you create a very framed and disciplined circumstance. To begin with, of course, the child feels forced and pushed, but in the end, what's the point? Restore their sense of security. And out of that, restore their self-control, and then enable them to feel loved, and restore trust, and restore normal human relationships. So little girls who are trying to seduce you don't seduce you anymore, because do you understand, they lived in an environment where they were being sexually abused. So how do you please the person you're supposed to please? Do you understand the sort of thing that's going on? So, that's how did I get there? Okay, so we need to cut off from this type of influence. I was trying to say, you take yourself out of a bad environment where you're receiving many bad influences, not just physically but also spiritually, and you go into a spiritually very high environment, then very, 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 very helpful. In other words, people with good thoughts, people with love, people with real concern and care, ultimately it penetrates, and you're lifted out of that very bad, not just physical but spiritual environment. So what decides good and evil? What determines good and evil? So please don't misunderstand, speaking German is not evil. I guarantee it. I have a German wife. It doesn't make you evil, I promise you. Similarly, eating fruit doesn't make you evil. I mean, these are all give and take actions, you know. But sex doesn't make you evil. Sex is amazingly beautiful, but it has to be in the right context, do you understand? It has to be in the right heart, and the right motivation, the right context, correctly under the correct law, but ultimately under the correct heart. So when the motivation is incorrect, the relationship becomes damaging. The key to decide good and evil is not, you know, men and women, that's always good. No, it's not always good. Some people might say man and man, sexual relation, that's not good. But man and woman doesn't have to be good either. It's motivation, do you understand? I'm not suggesting, by the way, that man on man sexually is necessarily good. Ultimately, it's heart and motivation. And many, many things that are not right can be explained by very damaging previous experience. And also spiritual influence and many things like that. Okay, so, you know, this is the same pattern, do you understand? It's the same structure, it's the same order, but the motivation is different. And then the outcome is completely different. Not the original outcome, because the motivation is wrong. So good and evil is determined. If this is God's motivation, this is Satan's motivation. This motivation will lead to something good. This motivation will lead to something very bad. Because the interactions are exploitative. They're self-destructive and destructive of others. So actually through this fall, when Adam and Eve made their relationship, they created a family. You know, this is Adam, this is Eve. She seduced him, he gave in to his immediate sexual, self-centered desire, and then was allowed himself to be seduced. This relationship was not a good foundation. It didn't create what was supposed to be created. Something very different emerged out of it. And something passed from generation to generation, which was not the heart and love of God. Of course, some element of that is still within them, but some other element also passed, which is what we call the fallen nature. It means evil is a pattern of behavior which repeats itself in my life, in other people's lives, and also down through the generations. And it's the same type of stupid mistake that we make again and again and again. And it comes from exactly the same scenario as is described here. So this is to do with what the origin of this type of mind went through. That's Lucifer. So first of all, Lucifer can't see things from God's point of view because he loses confidence in God. And then he starts to see everything not from the point of view of, you know, I'm under the love of God, and if I trust in God and give myself for the sake of God and others, all will be well. He breaks that relationship. It means he starts to look at everything, not trying to understand what's God's point of view or what's for the benefit of everybody, but starting to think what might be good for me to overcome my lack of love feeling. And that then becomes the motivation for everything. So first thing is you lose the point of view of love. You lose the point of view for others, and instead you get the point of view centering on myself. Do you understand the difference? It's crucial. So if you embark on a relationship to make another person's life benefit, it may look the same as someone who's embarking on a relationship not for the other person's benefit, but ultimately to exploit them. Because the other person won't connect to you unless you trick them to think that you're relating for their benefit. So Lucifer wasn't relating to Eve for Eve's benefit, but he convinced her he was. Otherwise she wouldn't have engaged. Do you understand? But this is not the motivation. So he wasn't acting to accomplish God's will. He was engaging in a give and take action where he was not connected to God from his point of view. So what was he also doing at the same time? It means he was leaving his proper responsibility. And ultimately, what did he do? He reversed the proper order. So instead of everything being under God, and instead ultimately of him receiving the love of God through Adam and Eve, as the ones who would be closer to God than him, he actually reversed that order. And that created a lot of evil, which grew and grew and grew. So that's depicted in these. I've got to watch now, I'm going over even the other time limits. So this is the diagrammatic explanation. So instead of having confidence in God and relating to Adam and Eve out of God's intention, he did it another way. He had his own self-centered point of view, left his position, left his responsibility, wasn't doing what God wanted him to do, started doing what he wanted to do. So the teacher, we just had recently in Britain about 2 months ago, a teacher who was arrested for sexually interfering with the children in the classroom. And he was well respected in the school. He was a head of department in a junior school. And the parents were shocked out of their minds. Shocked out of their minds. Because he left his proper position, which was to teach and love and look after them in place of parents, and sexually misused them. So leaving proper position, and then having led proper position, dominating others to do what you want to do. Not creating the order of dominion centering on God, but the order of dominion centering on your selfish desire. And then, spreading evil, multiplying evil, expanding evil, impacting the lives of others so that this give and take action spreads and spreads and multiplies and multiplies. So final point is about sin. So I flash to the last one, because this is about the tree of sin. So you could have the tree of goodness, or the tree of life, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it will be a symbol for life. The origins of life should be the love of God, and the love of God would grow and grow in your life, and from its trunk would come branches and would come leaves, and ultimately would come flowers and fruit. That's how life should be growing. But this is the tree of sin. It means the origin was corrupted. Why? Because the motivation was not to do with love. The motivation was a deceit. It wasn't true love. It was initiating a relationship not for the benefit, not for the fulfillment of God's will, not for the sake of the other, but selfishly. And then that grew into a practice in daily life which manifested itself down the generations. So ultimately, Tim Miller, as all fallen human beings who came from Adam and Eve, I am the fruit of that original sin. Not only that, in my ancestry behind me, of course I have good ancestors who did good things, but inevitably because of this origin, there are many messy things, in my family history going back through the generations. These are creating conditions. What are these conditions? These are creating conditions that I am influenced, not by God, but I'm influenced by the tradition that originally sprang from Satan. And it's influencing me not just directly through that first action, but also through the wrong traditions and wrong conduct in my ancestry and background. And also through the sins not just of my family, but also the sins of my race, or the sins of my religion, or the sins of my group. We call this collective sin. But ultimately, all this background, of course I have a better background, which is coming from God's influence through religion and righteous ancestors, so I have another background. But this is the tree of sin, right? That background is ultimately expressing itself through my personal misconduct, which is an expansion of this, root, trunk, branch, leaf, flower, and fruit. So that's another consequence of it. So we see so much flowering of evil, so much fruiting of evil, because of this origin. Thanks very much, everybody.